Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 58 of the ABT Time podcast in which we really tend to focus primarily on narrative issues and try and use the narrative tools from the ABT model to make some sense out of things we see in the world today. And in this three-part special, we're looking at two case studies side by side, one from North Dakota, one from Australia. And now in today's episode, we're going to have three of the members of our ABT narrative training group join in with me in discussing what we've heard in these two discussions and presentations of the two issues. So the unifying title of all of this, and really the lesson that we're hoping to point out, is something that we kind of live by, which is nobody buys a solution without a problem. This is really a fundamental dynamic that everyone should take to heart. It's great to put together great ideas, but unless you've got a public out there that feels there's a problem, that they're looking for a solution, you're going to have a hard time selling it to them, because they'll end up just saying, that's a nice solution, but we don't feel there's a problem. So the whole process needs to begin by making sure there is a problem, people are ready to respond to it. As I say, the first case study was North Dakota 10 years ago, this ballot initiative they had called Measure 5, trying to allocate some of the state's oil and gas revenues to conservation issues. That failed tragically, 20-80. And then last October in Australia, something called the Voice referendum, which was an equally well-intended effort that was, well, we'll get into detail and talking about it, what it was trying to do, but trying to strengthen the Aboriginal voice and rights in the whole country of Australia. And then today's discussion. So when we're done with the discussion, I will, and we recorded this a week or so ago, but when it ends, I'll come back on with a little bit of wrap up to kind of pull it all together and synthesize and really kind of offer up three central points of recommendations and things to think about, drawing again on our narrative tools. So we have the two case studies, the North Dakota case study from 10 years ago and the Australian case study from last October. The paint has sort of dried on the North Dakota study. That happened a decade ago. Rick Nelson had mentioned that when it took place, one of the people he worked with on it said that vote would set things back 10 years for conservation efforts in the state of North Dakota. It's been 10 years now, and sure enough, nothing has happened. So he was right when he said that. The Australia situation is a situation where the paint has not dried. It only happened last October. And as a result, that's the main one we're going to focus on in this discussion. And I've got three guests that will be joining us, two at the start that are both Australians. First off, Jayde Lovell, who is the owner of the ReAgency science marketing organization. She's got a background in communications and neuroscience. She did her work and graduate work at Melbourne University in Australia, where she lives. And she also makes videos on her SciQ channel on YouTube that's a part of the Young Turks Network. I've been working with her for about 8 years or so. She moved to New York City for a while, around 2015. She's a part of our ABT group, as is Dr. Rod Lamberts. Met him probably 15 years ago or so in South Korea at something called the Seoul Forum. The three of us actually did a panel at South by Southwest in 2018. Rod is the Associate Director of Science and Education at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science at the Australian National University. And our third guest, Park Howell, is longtime part of our ABT group. He is from the business world. He's an advertising agency guy from way back when, but more importantly, the host of the very popular podcast, The Business of Story. He's approaching his 500th episode, that podcast. And great guy who's contributed a lot in the development of our ABT model. So on that note, let's get started with our guests. Let's have both of you join me here, Rod and Jayde. And let's begin with, Jayde, hopefully that's enough an introduction for you. Just give us a couple minutes here of your thoughts on, because both of you were there to experience the Voice referendum that took place last October before I was in touch with either of you about it. What was your take on the whole thing once you saw the dust had settled?
Well, I definitely saw it coming because our newly elected Prime Minister Albanese had declared from day one that he was going to have a referendum on this issue, and that was a terrible strategy because he'd just been elected and he'd done absolutely no work whatsoever at telling the story of why we needed to have a referendum, why we needed to have a voice. So he hadn't made the case that there was any problem whatsoever,
Okay, so
and
let's lock that down as one of the very first points is the absence of context, right? I mean, I know there's hundreds of years of all the experience, things like that, but still, that what you're saying is he bypassed. Are we all on the same page here and jumped right in? So, okay, great, keep going.
he was such a scientist. Like he was very close to the issue. He thought that everyone else had the same perspective that he did, the same context that he did. But
Let's make a second point on that. And as I said, this is a very analytical podcast we're doing here. This is not for the general public. But the second point I'd mentioned at the beginning of the first episode, a few of the tools that we'll bring into bear in this. And what you're hitting on there then is this simple diagram of inner circle versus outer circle. And what you're saying is that he was absolutely part of the inner circle and not thinking so much about the outer circle. So yeah, keep going.
which is a shame because he was then surprised by the outcome, which he should never have been. Because if he'd been in touch with the average Australian person, and the in no state did they get above 50% for the yes campaign. So the average Australian voted no. And if he'd been in touch with that, he would have seen this coming and potentially would have done things differently. So I definitely saw it coming as soon as in Australia, there's a terrible history of referendums always turning out no. It's very difficult to get a referendum passed. Of the last 45, only 8 have been successful, and 7 of those had bipartisan
Whoa, whoa,
support.
whoa, whoa. Okay, Hank, slow that down a little bit. Say that again nice and slowly. You say there have been 45 of these sorts of referendums. And
Yes, since Australia was first founded, there's been 45 referendums. So taking a legally binding question to the public, and only 8 occasions has the referendum been successful. And on 7 of those occasions, they had bipartisan support. And this was an issue that did not have bipartisan support. And unless
although it did initially, right?
there was never going to be, I think even though one party had come up with the idea, there was no reason for them to support it moving forward because they were able to make more political hay by opposing it and being a voice for the no campaign. So
Yeah.
they did what was best for them, which is what politicians do.
Okay, let's see. Let's tack on your 2 other comments you sent me on the email yesterday. So your first one is, why does this happen so much in Australia? So many failed initiatives like this. And then your second observation was, why does it
So it
also
happens
happen?
It
Yeah.
happens in the US. So I'm reading this book by the great philosopher Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he talks about his political campaign. In 2005, he had 4 items on the ballot. So a similar situation to Australia. He had a referendum and he lost all 4, despite having just been popularly elected. And what he took from that is he just had his ass handed to him. And he knew it was because he hadn't told the people a story that they could understand. He'd used words like gerrymandering, which doesn't make sense or isn't relevant to the normal everyday person. And he said, from that point on, I had to be really good at telling people this is going to create jobs, this is going to be good for families. And after that, like catastrophic loss, he was able to pass most of those initiatives just using different language and by telling the story. So this isn't just an Australian thing, it happens everywhere in the world, but we can learn from it and we can recover.
Okay, and that was your third point is why don't we learn? We'll get into that later. And then a side note, in a bit, we'll have Park Howell join us, and he's the host of the podcast, The Business of Story. And he lives and breathes the need for tell a good story around an issue or a brand or anything like that. You know, that's how you make these things happen. So on that note, let's switch over to Dr. Rod Lamberts, who will begin by explaining to us why he had to retire from that science communication program due to injuries in 2013 sustained on the job, I'm assuming.
No, first we have to talk about the small matter of my bill for the therapy session you mentioned in your introduction on my podcast. And with interest, that's amounting to quite a sum. So, we'll just get that out of the way. I'm glad we got rid of that. I retired injured. It was nothing to do with the job. It was everything to do with my own hitherto unrealized congenital internal matters, which all blew up a few months into me being president. It was like, I can't go on any longer. So I
Oh,
had to.
oh, well, that's disappointing. No, I thought
I
there
know,
was
I
a
know.
story there about you sustained injury from the committee meetings or something that you had to.
Well, look, there was a hint of that, but it was more dangerous that I might instill injury. So that was probably best for all concerned that I
Tired, injured.
stepped
Okay, you got
away.
anything to add there to Jayde's opening?
It would depend. I don't want to start going into the unpacking without doing it to your sort of your milestones or your steps. But yeah, look, I was here obviously for it as well. I represent or sit in the only area, the capital territory, that voted yes. And I was convinced from the moment it started that it would fail. I hoped that it wouldn't, but I was convinced it would. I was also pretty convinced that the ACT, where I live, would vote yes, and we did quite strongly. But that's no surprise at all, because I always describe us as the Scandinavia of Australia. We're this little kind of unusual enclave of people who are overly educated, overly well paid, very, very safe, very, very well organized, super intellectual, left leaning, blah, blah, all the stuff you'd expect. So I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed, but not at all shocked. And yeah, for
let me
many
ask one
reasons that I'm sure
quick
into.
question. Jump back to Jayde for 1 second. You said
Yeah.
45 of those initiatives, 8 succeeded. Did any of those involve making alterations to the Constitution?
So all of them are constitutional changes.
Oh,
That's
they are
the
all of them. Okay.
all of
Okay.
them, yeah. But the last one that was successful, I think, was in the 50s or 60s, and I think it was should Aboriginals be counted as people, and that was successful, and it had bipartisan support. But you can kind of get from the fact that we had to ask that question that it's not always a friendly environment for change, particularly when it comes to Native Australians.
Yeah, yeah. So, Rod, did you have more you were saying there?
Well, that kind of links into one of the many things I'd say about this, but a core one is this notion of national pride, our image of ourselves versus the reality of ourselves. And I think that wove into the backdrop of this referendum and indeed many others. At least for once, pride stood up and meant something. I think that was in '67 when Aboriginal people became people.
Mm.
Small yay with a very tiny flag there. That's a horrifying thought to remember. It's easy to be deeply ashamed when you're an overly educated, left-leaning, blah blah blah, white male, etc. in this country when you hear things like that or are reminded. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to dive into details. It's your podcast. You should
Yeah,
lead us.
yeah.
I'm
No,
happy
no,
to.
we're going to get into all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Let's quickly run through these 4 elements that we used in the 2 case studies, which is the first thing was what was the solution that they went forward to the public with? And in the case of North Dakota, it was allocating 5% of the state's oil and gas revenues to conservation issues. In the case of Australia, as Molly had said, it was, I think, 2 things was the change to the Constitution and then creating an actual voice mechanism to help the Aboriginal nation. The second element is what was the outcome, as we've just reviewed there. North Dakota, they lost 80-20. In Australia, lost all 5 states and lost one of the 2 territories. The third thing was what was the post-mortem. And this is where it gets interesting with Jayde. Well, let's see. I made 2 trips to North Dakota. The first one you went along on. We sat there for 2 days in that conference room. They brought in one person after another. It was really kind of a treat that they had all these folks explain to us what had gone on. One of the things we got to see was that the opposition made one really powerful, albeit distorted, commercial that they ran on TV and pulled the rug out from under their opponents. And the environmental folks made incredibly bad commercials that were put together by media groups from outside the state that didn't understand the demographic dynamics of anything to do with the state. So there was so much failure in that side. In the case of Australia, the postmortem of what happened, and that was what I mentioned a little while back, was that even in that ABC News clip, they talk about there was an initial feeling that there was bipartisan support for this, but then everything flipped. And at that point is when a lot of the disinformation came out as well. I have to say, without jumping too deep into it and watch, I'm going to present a few quotes from that clip in a bit. But what you saw there was, I mean, one of the most prominent things for me, and I'm very much in the outer circle for this issue, Aboriginal rights. I lived there, but I've never really dug into it. And so I'm not familiar with a lot of the dynamics. But one of the first things that grabbed me was they had their lead spokesman for the no side was Aboriginal himself. And man, that tangles up the communication dynamics. If we understand the power and importance of the singular narrative, then all of a sudden you're looking at this Aboriginal voice spokesperson on TV who's saying we're against this.
We
And
have one Aboriginal senator, only one that's been elected, and she was against it as well.
God, man,
You
talk
think you
about
would shore those details up before you went ahead.
that's exactly. We will get into those sorts of things. Really unfortunate. And then the fourth element is what I labeled as the bus is in the ditch. And the thing that I'll probably bring up again later, but what Rick Nelson in his discussion kind of concluded with was that when they lost that vote, one of the organizers that was on a committee he was on said to everybody, this vote is going to set back conservation efforts in the state by 10 years. It's now 10 years later, and that turned out to be absolutely right. They've done nothing in the 10 years since then. They just gave up. They got obliterated and gave up. In the case of Australia in this issue, it's only 6 months or so. What are you going to do is the question. And they should take note that, at least in this parallel case study, they let 10 years go by without doing anything. You kind of need to hit the ground running with the next strategy and have a, plan B or whatever to go after and things. It's not clear that that's
an even closer example than North Dakota was in Australia in 1999. We had a referendum to become a republic. And even though the Queen wasn't super popular and no one really wanted her to be the leader of our country, we still voted no to becoming a republic. And I remember at the time when it lost, them saying we won't be able to have another referendum on this issue for at least another 10 years. And that was 1999. It's now 25 years later. So, and there is no sign really of the Republic campaign. So,
but that one was a case study. That one was an absolute case study in how to make sure it was voted against. The Prime Minister at the time was a monarchist, right-wing conservative chap. And he did a very cunning thing. He said, do you want, insert long, complicated, legalistic phrase about change to constitution, or leave it the hell alone? And no one is going to do the research to find out what long, legalistic phrase means. So everyone went, oh, it seems fine now. Why would I change it? Boom, that was it. That's all it took.
Well, that's very interesting, because now let me jump into a few of the highlights of that ABC clip that I was sent. And it opens with two clips, exactly what you're talking about there. They had an Aboriginal woman who, standing on the street, and she said, people feel rejected, speaking from her side. And then they cut to average white male Australian also standing on the street. And he said it was about saying no to change of constitutional powers. And that's sort of playing into what you just said, Rod, isn't it? That, all else equal, people would rather not go out and change something.
But look, I'd also add, I kind of blame your people. This is anecdotal, but I think if you ask the average Australian what's in the Constitution, they go, But what they might do is recite things from American popular culture, because, you guys have at least a broadcast tendency to revere this document. Most of our people wouldn't have the foggiest what's in it, wouldn't really care until you said you want to change it. But then it hits, I think, a lizard brain thing where they go, seems really important in all the movies and TV I watch. Therefore, changing that is evil, wrong, and dangerous.
And so much that's from the US, you're saying.
I think so. Because honestly, I work with educated people. I know legal scholars, and even those, they say, well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I think it's got that in it. We don't know.
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay. All right. So here's 4 quotes that I pulled out of there that'll set the context of this stuff, and then we'll dive in deeper. The first one is from marketing strategist Toby Ralph, who said, the yes side lost this. The no didn't win it. That's got a lot of depth to it. Second quote from Jeff Scott, who was from the yes side, I think, said there wasn't enough focus on what the real benefit was going to be. That's cueing Park Howell, who we'll bring on in a few minutes, because that's right on the nose of this issue of nobody buys a solution without a knowing what the problem is. Third quote is from Warren Mundine, the political strategist for Aboriginal issues, who was the Aboriginal fellow who was major leader, I think, for the no side. And he said the yes side had a feel of being elitist and corporate versus the no side feeling more grassroots. And then the last thing was the voiceover for the segment. The woman said, as the campaign postmortem continues, the way forward remains unclear. And so that's where we are. At this point, let's bring on Park Howell, the host of the Business of Story, longtime business advertising agency guy, who's approaching his 500th episode of the Business of Story, and has been one of our partners and collaborators in the ABT project for over a decade now, and is a member of the course. And two things, Park. First off, tell us about the Christopher Lochhead quote that came up when you were on his show, who Christopher Lochhead is and why that quote is so
Yeah.
apropos to all this.
No, it's great to be here. And yeah, Christopher Lochhead is a legendary Silicon Valley marketer, knows how to deal in, tech communication, especially when you're dealing with a lot of commodities. How do you really strike that chord? And when I was on his show talking about the and but therefore, it was the first time he'd ever heard about it. And he sent me a note a couple days later that he started using it. And he goes, "This is blowing my mind." And then I had him on my show a little bit after that, and he was saying he loves it because it's very much in line with what they do around market category design or trying to find that singular narrative, what can make you a category king. And he said, as you said earlier, nobody buys a solution unless they have an effing problem, is actually what how he says it. And with what you're talking about, if people haven't seen the first two episodes leading up to this, two really fascinating case studies that have the same problem, and that is what I call this halo effect. The good people have a good mission, and they just assume everybody is going to say, "This is good. I'm voting yes." And they never take the time. The good people don't take the time to really understand that audience, that constituents, and what's in it for them. And if they don't have a problem, then whatever solution that the good people are pitching doesn't matter. And they'll get clocked, just like you saw in both of those cases.
And to that specifically, the second trip that I made up there, Rick Nelson brought me back, and I brought along with me my cameraman and also another crew member, my interpreter, namely my younger brother from Kansas, who grew up working in the oil fields and with agricultural folks. And he speaks the language of blue collar workers out in those areas. And we spent a week driving counterclockwise around the entire state of North Dakota. They lined us up with a whole bunch of their contacts, people, and mostly it was people from the opposition. And one person in particular, this woman who was a realtor in Fargo, who spoke about the whole issue. And she said, "We're overrun by wildlife here. Why would we want to channel government funds into creating more wildlife? We have friends from North Carolina who come here every year to hunt because they say, there's a shortage in North Carolina, but we come here and you just got birds and ducks and geese and deer running all over the place. Why would you take money that could be used for education, yada, yada, yada?" There was no perception of a problem. So that's why that case study is relevant to what we're talking about here. And then I think, Jayde, you were saying that from the outset, and I think all of you, was the failure to first off understand the context. And secondly, I'm interested. The first thing that kind of struck me, Rod, was that why wasn't there an effort to try and frame this as a part of Australian pride, as a broader messaging campaign that, it's really crucial that we can be proud of our country, that we do a good job taking care of our Aboriginal populations. And is there some way to shape it into a reason why somebody who's not part of the issue would say, "Yeah, okay, all right, I can support that." But it doesn't sound like there was much effort in that direction at all. Would that have worked at all in Rod?
I think that there might have been hope. I mean, it struck me when I think about this campaign that there was a core, I was going to, not quite message, but there is a core concept, which was it's not fair. But it's not fair meant different things to different constituents in this issue. And so that the whole kind of Australian, image of ourselves as giving everyone a fair go, it's our classic line. That can be called upon, but I think it was accidentally called upon by both yes and no. They kind of stumbled onto it. So the yes people were saying, "Look, it's blatantly not fair. We're treating these people as not quite people. They've been here forever. That's terrible." Some of the no people, it was by no means a consistent voice other than no, was saying, "Well, why the hell should they get special treatment? There's a billion of us, so to speak, and a lot of us are suffering. It's not fair that they should get special treatment over us. We work hard. We find the cost of living is going up, etc." So I think, in theory, playing to the fair go or fairness thing is a great idea, but this was implicitly played to, and it shot off in multiple directions.
Yeah, and to that point, as far as I could see, what I saw was that the Aboriginal population is 3.7% of the total population of Australia, so it's pretty small.
It's also not a unified voice. That's the other myth, the Aboriginal people say no now. It's like, well, that's not true either.
Oh
Some,
boy.
like any community, there are multiple voices with different rationales, different interest groups.
Yeah. Okay.
The thing, so even if you'd gone with
yes.
your idea, Andy, of having talking about a fair go, which is something that's really Australian, people got confused between equity and equality. So equality is like we all have the same legal representation. So a voice actually isn't fair because it gives preference to other people. It gives preference to a certain group, but it's fair because they didn't have equity. They didn't have the same opportunities. But that point was never made. So
Yeah.
the average, my family all voted no, except for my mother, who I got to first and early on in the campaign. But like all my aunts and cousins and uncles, they had no idea that there was a problem.
And to that very point, another little anecdote parallel to this, just 3 weeks ago, a buddy of mine's the head of a major ocean conservation group here in the US and sent me an email about the issue going on right now Northeast about wind farms and whales. And the wind farms are essential to have any hope of combating climate change. And climate change is clearly going to be the doom of the North Atlantic right whales because they're being forced to shift further north. So there's got to be this work being done. But the fossil fuel industry is anti-wind energy. And so they've been raging or running a campaign where every North Atlantic right whale that's found dead, they find a way to blame it on the wind farms. And what my buddy said was he said, and here's what's going on. You know, the opponents of wind farming are saying, look, it's simple. They're killing whales. The proponents of alternative energy, their answer is it's complicated. And you don't get to do that. That if that's what's in your mind, it's complicated. Things have gone wrong, and that's what you're just talking about right now. Was that there's multiple things, and the Aboriginal population, blah blah blah. You've got to find your way if you're going to do something at the broad scale. It's got to be some fairly simple sloganing. And on that note, Park, let's segue from your first point there about nobody buys a solution without a problem into the three-part mechanism you talk about in the course. And how about if you take it from there, because this is crucial in that.
Yeah. So when you're looking at your audience, you're trying to really understand what problem will you be solving for them that you need to make crystal clear to them that it is in their best interest, in this case, to vote for it. And so we just like to use this three-part: find the hurt, amplify the pain, and heal the wound. And that hurt is not your hurt, it's the hurt of the audience. If you can help them overcome that with whatever initiative it is you are trying to get them to buy into, you first have to identify it, and then you've got to ratchet it up, right? In all great storytelling, it's got to be urgent, it's got to be important, it's got to be surprising in some cases. So you want
and let me add to that part
pain.
right there. So couldn't join us today, but Matthew David is my colleague in the course. And he's got a short mini lecture on that part of your three-step process, which is once you find the hurt, you have to amplify it. You've got to take it. And what he does is points out in this is where the people in the entertainment business understand these dynamics. They deal with this mass communication day in and day out. You get all these political campaigns that are put together by these people that just have their gut instinct, and they don't really have the experience to be drawing on from their gut. But what you see in movie making, and he uses three prime examples: Star Wars, The Matrix, and The Hunger Games. In all three of those stories, they begin by identifying a problem, and the main character usually just doesn't think it's a problem, and somebody else comes along and amplifies and points it out. And that's exactly what happens with in Star Wars with Obi-Wan Kenobi. He points out to Luke Skywalker, you think this is a small problem. I'm here to tell you this is a massive problem. And that's exactly what ought to be thought about for if you want to pass this thing at a national level, some sort of referendum, you got to first off figure out why it is a problem for these people. Then you've got to put together a campaign to amplify it, not through dishonesty and exaggeration, but by putting together the rational argument about look at it in this context. This is what framing is about. Look at it from this perspective. And when you do, you see, wow, you really do need to act on this or else there's going to be consequences. And then the third part of your three-step process. Go through the three steps again quickly.
Yeah, find the hurt, amplify the pain, heal the wound. That's your call to action. That's what it is you are going to do about it to lead them into a better day, a brighter life, that future that you're trying to sell them.
There you go. And Rod, Jayde, your thoughts on that happening and not happening?
I think one way to make it real is to think like no one really goes on a drastic diet to lose 5 kilos or 5 pounds. You wait until it hurts too much. And when you look in the mirror and you go, oh my God, I'm 50 pounds overweight. I need to do something drastic. This is really painful. I don't fit into any of my clothes. And then people get serious. So no one will really bother with a solution if the problem isn't painful enough. So as you say, Park, amplifying the problem is really important.
It's really fundamental. Yeah, we're getting towards the end of this discussion. Kind of wanted to keep it fairly bare bones here and hitting some of these major points. I've got three sort of questions to finish on focusing on. Let me dive into those now. And so here's the first one is very simple question, and the two Australians can maybe offer up perspectives on this. Why were there no baby steps? Why were there no pilot experiments? Why wasn't this attempted at a small regional level, neighborhood level, something like that? Why did they jump in with $67 million for a budget at the national level without testing that? And I think you kind of opened with this, Jayde, but let's go back and revisit what you were saying there at the beginning, which was that it just was jumped into. So why were there no baby steps?
Yeah, so Anthony Albanese had committed to, when he ran for Prime Minister, that he was going to do this. And so from the day he was elected, we were expecting this referendum. And they didn't have any examples of anything similar that had worked. They hadn't spent any time, because there'd been the Conservative government in power before that. So they hadn't spent any time talking about the problems, about, the Aboriginal the disparities between your average Australian and an Aboriginal Australian. So there was not only no baby steps, but no training, no pre-show, no.
And I think another key word you're hitting on there was no groundswell.
No groundswell.
No outcry. Yeah, which is what you want, as the public saying we've got to act on this. And it's pretty tough when you're trying to make something happen and that's not there to begin with.
Man, they were doing anything because we'd had Conservative governments being progressively more embarrassing and shitful for quite some time. So they were just like, what's going to get us in? Let's just get in, then we'll sort it out later.
Yeah.
This is just part of that, I think. I don't think there was no genuine intent, but it was certainly a useful step to wedge their fingers in the door.
Well, and so my second question here, we've also already kind of touched on. My question was, what was the unifying slogan? And in that ABC News clip, they had a little snippet from what was clearly a national television campaign ad. And I think it was a young Aboriginal boy who said, "Yes makes it possible." So I guess that's the closest thing. And yet that wasn't, I don't think was on billboards or anything like that. Did you guys get hit over the head by any clear slogan?
I saw that. And my question, because of, the business I'm in, is what's it?
Yes, right.
But again, I was surrounded, I'm in the enclave of, the good people, as Park was describing, so I only paid some attention because I never thought it was going to fly. In terms of other slogans, I didn't see many. I've been in trouble for this for years, but I'd keep saying to people like this, take the tactics of your opposition. Drum one message home. Stop offering detail. Stop showing how good you are. Stop showing how moral your case is. Choose one goddamn slogan or a set of three, like we've seen often works. Just do that. No matter what, just do that.
Well, and I can tell you, sadly, in my country, you can look at examples such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and I hate to say it, but even Make America Great Again. Those are all characterized by exactly what you're saying, picking the singular thing. And then sadly, painfully, you take a look at these mass rallies that happen nowadays after mass shootings. One really bad one in Nashville a year ago. And you look at the photos and no two signs are identical. You look at the Black Lives Matter rallies and you'll see 5 to 10 to 15 signs that all just say Black Lives Matter. You've got, in a world of too much information, exactly what you're saying. You've got to pick that singular thing, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just got to get everybody echoing it behind it. And that did not happen. And exactly that phrase, yes, makes it possible. Exactly. What is it? And then tied in with this, that's straight out of what we work on in the ABT model, is the power and importance of the singular narrative. It's not about going after 8 problems. You've got to find the one thing. And one anecdote that I cite constantly, again, sadly, in August 2016, Hillary Clinton was on Meet the Press, and Chuck Todd, the host, asked her for her presidential campaign, what is the one thing that's at the core of your campaign? And she scoffed and said, "Oh, Chuck, we're not as simple as one thing. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this." And the whole shopping list, and it did not work. And as we learn from our friends who teach improv acting, they have a little catchphrase, which is, if everything is special, nothing is special. And if you have 8 problems, people walk away not remembering any of them. That's what leadership is about. You finding your way down to the singular one narrative. And towards that end, then you can see in that ABC News clip the evidence of this, which is that they had just the one Warren Mundine, voice for the no campaign, interviewed in there. But clearly they talked about how the yes side was already split between a lawyer and a professor that were one group. And then there was another, I think, professor at University of New South Wales who had a budget of $10 million. So you already had 2 major factions that were running this thing. This is the problem with the climate movement. There's no leadership. There's all these different competing groups, literally competing groups, that are trying to do the best branding campaign, and they don't add up to a mass movement because of the absence of leadership. So at some level, you've got to find your way into somebody being in charge, I think.
It's also absence of followership, mate. It's people, again, on the left, where we think too hard, we have too many details. Instead of saying, you know what, this is good enough, let's run with this first, and we're just going to follow that one. But instead, we're going to bicker over detail. And I speak this as the in crowd, and it drives me crazy. Bickering over every little nuance in detail to the detriment of any kind of movement whatsoever that goes forward. And
then the next thing you know, when that happens, is you end up in the Holy Grail with the guy saying, let's not bicker over who killed who.
Exactly.
And that is the tendency to not want to do the postmortem, which is exactly what happens with a lot of these groups. They spend a fortune and then they just walk away and say, let's just not talk. Let's get it behind us. Let's move on.
I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. It's what about the failure of the issue? That kind of hurt a few feelings, didn't it?
Let's not bicker over who killed who.
Wait,
hang on a second, Jayde. What were you going to say there?
What you would do in marketing is we always imagine our customer, and then we think, how would our customer react to this commercial? And so if anyone on the Yes campaign had done that and said, well, let's imagine our customer, who's your average non-Aboriginal voter, they would have seen those people already have political biases. How are they going to interpret something like changing the referendum? They're going to be scared. They've already voted no recently to changing the referendum. If they just imagined who they were talking to, they would have seen this coming from the very beginning, but they didn't put that effort in.
Yeah. Park, were you going to say something?
The last thing, I think one of the big downfalls is people don't pay enough attention to the successes and the failures in business branding. All of their answers are right there for these sorts of referendums and initiatives and whatever. I just did some research in a blog post on FedEx, and I put them in one of my shows, and I didn't realize that, their singular narrative, when it absolutely positively has to be there overnight. That story began 45 years ago. It lasted 20 years. And then about every 2 years, they started changing it. They changed it until they came back. And I guarantee you the reason why they changed it is they got a new CMO every time. And that new CMO had to put their stamp on it. Well, what are they doing now? Not only have they come back to when it absolutely positively has to be there overnight, they have actually truncated it now to just absolutely positively, because it is so well worn. Everybody knows that story about FedEx. They went astray for 2 decades, and now they're back. And that's what all of these initiatives need to do, is that singular narrative and that really powerful, emotive slug line.
That is absolutely right. And it's not easy getting to the singular narrative, but it's essential. It's obligatory. You can't bypass that. And let's pull this then all together. What I hope that we did here was not sounding like we could have run a better campaign. I think what's important is just to take this more analytical approach. And I think at the core of all this discussion was basically this simple thing of setup, problem, solution. There's lots of ways that gets differentiated down the line. But the first thing Jayde started talking about was that they didn't bother with the setup. And then what Park has gone into is that they didn't really identify, that they didn't generate a mass movement that agreed on there being a problem. And then, Rod, where did you fit into this discussion?
Amplifying that pain.
I just I chime in from the side. I'm like Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets, I just trying to dive in where I can.
Rod actually gave me the very best advice, which was like, this isn't rocket surgery. Like, this is really simple, but Rod and I get to stay and Park as well get to stay in our job, because we can walk into a room and go, who's your audience and what are you trying to get them to do? And most of the time, people haven't bothered to figure that out before they call us. And so, if you know, it's not hard to do that research, but it hardly ever happens. So, you know, as long as people keep getting this wrong, we'll continue to have jobs. So keep it up, guys.
And in a world of too much information, that's exactly the predicament and dilemma. Last words on from the two Australians on the future of this issue. You know, I don't want to say anything too pessimistic. Rod, you got?
Okay, then I'll do it. 10 years is optimistic. Also, my suspicion in my waters, I feel like pretty soon we'll get a conservative government again, because we're fickle idiots who like to throw things away when they are working more than we actually realize. So that will put it back at least another 10 years. That's my, it's not pessimism, it's realism, as all pessimists say. So yeah, I don't see it going anywhere in a hurry. Maybe generational change when a bunch of us people die out and the people, the generation above me.
And Jayde, for the final word from Australia.
I think they should give up on a referendum or having a constitutional reform, but they don't require constitutional reform to make progress. So they need to start building that groundswell now. And then, you know, whoever is elected, hopefully will have to respond to that. There's a great campaign, if you're talking about a singular narrative, that has a really good slogan already called Pay the Rent. It's really simple. You live on this land. It's Aboriginal land, so you should pay the rent. Using successes of campaigns like that.
Wait. That seems kind of semi-brilliant to me. Where's that from? What's going on with it?
Yeah, and they, you know, you'd think it would be a not-for-profit, like pay the rent, and you know, anyone that lives in Australia can pay the rent, whatever amount they think is fair.
If it helps, the pros and cons on pay the rent, I agree, it's a good idea. The real danger there is there's a Midnight Oil song, classic, very activist, famous band for decades, which includes the time has come to pay the rent, do what's fair, etc. The beauty of that is they will immediately adopt that song if they make it bigger, and the horror of that is everyone will go, the fucking lefties are at it again. So
yeah,
it's true. It's true. Like, it's a really classic song. It's called Beds Are Burning. How Can We Sleep? You know, all that sort of stuff. So it lends itself beautifully to it, and therefore I'd be terrified because that's what they'll use. And then
I remember
every average Australian voter again is going to go, oh God, them again.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, to pull this all together, I want to thank all three of you very, very much. And I had started this three-part series by saying this is the 20-year anniversary of a book titled When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Park, you began by hitting the same sort of note. And it really is sad, because I think that both of these campaigns were put together by good people with the best of intentions. But it turns out the real world can be pretty ugly, and especially in a world of increasing amounts of misinformation, disinformation. So lots of work ahead. But on that note, okay, so let me now try and pull this together with a little bit of wrap up and synthesize what we've been through in these 3 episodes. The first thing I want to share with you is a good friend of mine who's Australian, who I've known for, I think, 40 years. He and I were marine biology scientists long ago in Australia. I have constant long discussions with him about all issues in Australia. And he offered this up. He listened to all 3 episodes and just had sent me this back in an email. And I thought it was really relevant and good to set the tone for the overarching synthesis of all this. He said, I would add that the referendum opened a lot of old scars and created heaps of new ones, reignited racism, always there, but revamped, and splintered communities, not least Aboriginals, into at least 3 camps. Group number 1, those who wanted anything, basically a voice with no real power, but just some constitutional recognition. So that was the first group, just wanted anything. Second group that wanted everything, basically those who wanted a treaty and nothing less. And then a third group, those totally disengaged from the mainstream Aussie and politics. And he asks whether maybe that's even the majority. In the ABC News clip that I mentioned early on, they had given, probably about 12 minutes or so, I think, overview of the whole issue, presented probably 6 months after the vote. And at the very beginning, they had a couple of just short little clips. They had an Aboriginal woman saying basically that everybody's hurting in the wake of this. And then they had your average white male Australian man on the street who basically said this was just a referendum where they wanted to change the Constitution, and most of us just felt no, don't change the Constitution. That's too big of a thing, too big of an ask. And I think that reflects number three there of what my friend had said. People that are just, we don't know quite what they're talking about here, but all else equal, let's just play it safe and not change anything. And that they just really, and that's, I think Rod Lamberts in this discussion talked a bit about that as well. People that just don't really understand how the Constitution even works. My friend went on to say, as Molly said, once the increasingly far-right liberal national parties turned on it, the referendum was dead, and I doubt that anyone could have saved it. Singular, coherent, truthful voice versus widespread disinformation is not a fair contest in our post-truthiness world, chock full of incredibly gullible folk, including, I'm sorry to say, supposedly well-educated ones. So just want to get this clear because Jayde had made a mention at the beginning that there wasn't bipartisan support. She was talking about when the vote actually happened, and that's obvious from the outcome of the vote. But the fact is, at the beginning, as they said in that ABC News segment, there was about two-thirds, the polling suggested two-thirds majority of people were supportive of it. And then once it came to a vote, that wasn't the case at all. So that's an important part of the story to be clear on. Now, we have, so as I say, it began as bipartisan. So there are 3 points that I want to offer up here from our perspective of the narrative training that we do. And maybe we're off the mark. Maybe we're not. This is just, nobody's paying us for this. This is our own little academic exercise, but hopefully it'll spur a little bit of thought and discussion. So the first of which is the overriding power and importance of the singular narrative. We can't say enough about that. Matthew, are you there? Can you say enough about the singular narrative and how important it is?
It is the most important part of what we do. It's the singular point of focus. It's what we build your entire narrative around. It's kind of important.
It's kind of like just about everything. So let's dig into that a little bit here. And there are 2 articles that we use day in, day out about this singular narrative issue. The first of which, and these are 2 articles that are from the past. This is one of the sad things in today's world, is this belief that knowledge has some expiration date on it. Actually doesn't. There's a lot of the best things have been done long in the past. So many people working communications today are way off the mark because they think that it's all changed and different. Most of these core dynamics are still the same. So this tremendous article was published in 2009, written by Nicholas Kristof, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times. Actually interviewed him a few years ago, and he told me he was kind of stunned at how popular and widely discussed this article ended up being, because he was just asked to write it for Outside Magazine. The title of it is Nicholas Kristof's Advice for Saving the World. And the subtitles, which is really important. What would happen if aid organizations and other philanthropists embraced the dark arts of marketing spin and psychological persuasion used on Madison Avenue, meaning the business and advertising community in the U.S.? We'd save millions more lives. This article, it's only 3 pages long, but it is packed full of very simple principles. The core of it is about he and his wife worked in Africa for many years. They saw many of these public health campaigns, education campaigns come and go. Most of them failed, and a few worked, and they put together their observations on what did and didn't work. And one of the core dynamics that he goes through in this article is about the singular narrative. The idea that when you present one thing, you get a certain size audience. If you try and present 2 things, already that audience begins to get smaller. And if you present 8 things, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Communication and narrative structure as at its most powerful with the singular, the one. And it means that you've got to try and embrace your whole big package of goals that you've got into a single overarching story that you can ideally boil all the way down to something very, very simple at the core. And here's the second article that is incredibly powerful. This was published in 2017, just a few months after Trump was victorious in the presidential election here in the US. And it was written by Dave Gold, who I got to be good buddies with and actually co-authored the Narrative Jim version of our book, for the version for politics. The title is Data-Driven Campaigns Are Killing the Democratic Party. The core of what he was talking about was that you've still got to have a story. You need to tell a story to the public. They've got to have some understanding of where we're going on a journey and why this is important and where you're headed to. His subtitle said, over 4 straight cycles, Democrats have suffered historic losses. Why? because they learned all the wrong lessons from Obama's success, meaning that all of these Democratic Party operatives thought that Obama won because he had such good polling and metrics and all these sorts of things. He won because he had a message that resonated with the public, which is hope and change. It's time to change things and make good on some promises. And most important inside of this article is one paragraph that we use all the time because it offers a very simple little metaphor. And here's what he said. Years ago, my political mentor taught me the problem with this approach. He was talking about the problem with of just coming to the public of a whole pile of issues, saying, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. Taught me this using a memorable metaphor. Issues are to a campaign message what ornaments are to a Christmas tree, he said. Ornaments make the tree more festive, but without the tree, you don't have a Christmas tree, no matter how many ornaments you have or how beautiful they are. Issues can advance the campaign story, but without a narrative frame, your campaign does not have a message, no matter how many issue ads or position papers it puts forward. So this is my feeling in looking at what happened with this campaign was there was an absence of this singular narrative. There was a whole bunch of things. We want to make things better for the Aboriginal nation, but there was not any single slogan. And ideally, if you can bring it all the way down to one word, in the segment with Rick Nelson about North Dakota, I introduced the Dobzhansky template, which is incredibly powerful. And it's the idea that nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. And that's an exercise that people should try and work on there for this issue in Australia. Nothing in Aboriginal rights today makes sense except in the light of what? Or in trying to get it adopted, the wider package of solutions adopted. It's the idea of trying to find what is that one singular thing. And here's a suggestion, and this could be way off the mark. So this is just for the hypothetical for trial and error. But imagine if you were to ask that question with the Dobzhansky template, and perhaps the key word is pride. What if you were to put together, what if the prime minister had been elected on a campaign platform in which pride was the central element, the singular word that everybody was in agreement that we want a government that we can be proud of. And then inside of that would be this first agenda item, which is to make things right with the people who were here before us, this country. And we can never have pride in our entire nation until we set that right. I don't know that that's exactly the direction to take, but that's how you use this stuff to get yourself to the singular narrative. And the reason I feel so passionate about this, I'm sorry, is that we've got a candidate running for president now who's a former president who has a message that he has not changed one bit in 10 solid years. And it's an extremely simple message. And because of its simplicity and repetition, the public has picked up on it. And an awful lot of people who in the beginning scoffed at it and dismissed it have finally come around to realizing it's actually a very serious, important message that he's got. And more importantly, 10 to 20 years from now, when the history books are written, that's going to be the story that's told about that particular candidate. He had this singular message, and that's the sort of scale you really ought to be thinking about. It takes a lot of time and effort to get things down to that, but you got to put that sort of thought in. So singular narrative is the be all and end all. Be glad to tell you a lot more about that at some point. Secondly, a point that I think Jayde was making, she was holding up that Schwarzenegger book, the idea that Arnold Schwarzenegger was in his book talks about being elected governor and assumed that he had a mandate, and he immediately set to work with 4 initiatives he wanted, and they all failed. And he realized, wait a second, a platform does not equal a mandate. Sounds like there's similar elements of that with what happened here, which was you got a new prime minister and felt that this voice referendum was a part of the mandate, and it turned out it wasn't. So important to keep distinction there. And lastly, this over and over again, we said it, Park Howell went through it in really nice detail. This idea that nobody buys a solution without a problem. You should not ever go forward with a whole campaign, especially one that involves $67 million, unless you're pretty certain that the whole, a large part of the public, not just in polling says, yeah, sure, I'd vote for that, but actually can articulate, this is a problem. We need a solution. Won't somebody please come up with a solution? That's when you can finally get something passed. And until you've reached that point, it's pretty much of a long shot to try and implement a big package of solutions when the public isn't crying out, saying they have a problem. So we saw in North Dakota, and I think that's what we see in Australia. So that is my overall synthesis of what I've heard here with these 3 episodes. And I want to thank all the guests that took part with us. They did a tremendous job. And if you got any thoughts or questions on this, feel free to write us an email through our website, which is abtframework.com. So thanks for listening.